Next, I'll hand it over to Dave Kraft of the Nuclear Energy Information Service.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everyone. The inappropriately labeled Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, the BRC, was established in January 2010 predominantly to conduct a comprehensive review of policies for managing the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. While examining a number of major issues pertaining to the generation, storage, transport, and ultimate disposal of the nation's high-level radioactive waste, it generated results more akin to a study to show as opposed to a study to know. The BRC and its attendant public meetings were dominated by nuclear power advocates, promoters and beneficiaries in government, academia, industry, and the nuclear industry sector. Principles and proposals for high-level radioactive waste management first developed and advocated by Safe Energy advocates in 2001, 9 years prior to the creation of BRC, were given only perfunctory and grudging platform, and then largely ignored and not incorporated into the final report. While the Commission charter was explicit about, quote, managing the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, Energy Secretary Stephen Chu made it abundantly clear several times in the first BRC meetings on March 25, 2013, that he was giving flexibility to the BRC to consider front-end options and how those would affect the back-end outputs. Seem to be having some problems here with my slides, so if you just give me a moment here, see if I can correct that. Well, anyway, I'll move on. Secretary Chu advised, and I quote, "I think it's safe to say that unless you step back and look at it all, if you just focus on just a tiny portion, we will probably not get to the wisest path." Because of this wide latitude explicitly granted by the Secretary, let me just turn this off for a moment. Be right with you here. Oh, still not working. Sorry. Because of this wide latitude granted by the Secretary, it was incumbent on the BRC to analyze and incorporate into its final recommendations not only the principles of waste management, but also the principles of waste minimization. In other words, don't produce it. The BRC did not merely fail to do this, it utterly ignored this crucial second principle completely. Demonstrating the GIGO principle, the BRC, in its final analysis, disregarded this latitude to examine all aspects of nuclear power and their impacts on the creation of high-level radioactive waste, resulting in a myopic and incomplete set of conclusions, largely self-serving of the ongoing interests of the nuclear industry and its advocates, and certainly not of the many members of the public whose input was disregarded. As a result, all subsequent debate in Congress and elsewhere has been artificially skewed towards serving the short-term and financial interests of the nuclear industry and its friends and advocates, rather than satisfying the long-term need for a final high-level radioactive waste disposal solution. Among the current, more controversial and cherry-picked BRC recommendation items are: 1. Construction of expensive and unnecessary so-called centralized interim storage high-level radioactive waste facilities, which you just heard about from the previous speaker, Rose Gardner, in West Texas and New Mexico. And both of these are being done in the absence of any progress towards establishing a permanent disposal facility, which was also a BRC recommendation. Second, allowing the use of the Nuclear Waste Fund to pay for transportation to and operation of the CIS before the final disposal repository is in operation. Third, a new, allegedly so-called consent-based approach to siting future nuclear waste management and disposal facilities. And finally, an implied large-scale transport of spent fuel to CIS and disposal facilities without prior adequate preparations and improvements in the national transportation infrastructure. Since 2012, several inept and/or failed attempts by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy to address the nation's high-level radioactive waste issues have occurred. The first was in 2013, the so-called waste confidence rule fiasco, where U.S. courts ordered the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to discard and rewrite previously unsupportable rules on high-level radioactive waste management and reactor licensing. The second was the DOE's unmandated and failed initiative in 2016 and 17 to conduct, quote, consent-based siting public scoping meetings, a process designed more to legitimize the creation of more radioactive waste rather than solve the current waste problems. Subsequent events have demonstrated the inadequacies of basing congressional debate and legislation on these narrowly focused and cherry-picked 2012 BRC recommendations. New and important considerations not known or even contemplated back in 2010 and 12, when the BRC was finalized, magnify those inadequacies. Among these are the nuclear industry violation of environmental justice principles and concerns, the ever-changing and worsening predicted effects of catastrophic climate disruption, the industry and NRC plans both to extend the operating lifetimes of current reactors and hence high-level radioactive waste production to as much as 80 years, and also to increase the high burnup fuel use in the reactors, changing the radioactive inventory and content of that radioactive waste considerably. And finally, the industry, NRC, and current administration plans to create an entire new fleet of so-called small modular nuclear reactors, which will change and add to the waste burden. To summarize, the recommendations of the BRC report, number one, failed in its initial mission. Number two, are anachronisms given the changes in the nuclear industry and the world has moved on in these past 10 years. And finally, they continue to fail to adequately address both the previous and current safety, environmental, and justice concerns of the safe energy community and the general public. In December 2021, the National Radioactive Waste Coalition, representing over 40 safe energy, environmental, and environmental justice organizations, sent a letter to the President and the Congress outlining the inadequacy of using the BRC recommendations as a basis for future radioactive waste legislation. Today, we come before you to express explicitly a new set of principles for humane and equitable nuclear waste policy that should serve as the guiding template for the development of any future legislation dealing with the creation, management, storage, transportation, and disposal of high-level radioactive waste. These principles will now be presented by my colleagues. Thanks for your consideration, and I'll put my email in the chat if you have any questions.